the warship spoke before anyone in the hangar did. "Welcome back, Admiral Elias Mercer." The voice rolled through Dock 12 like distant thunder under steel, low and ancient and impossible to ignore. Every light along the belly of the decommissioned cruiser flared to life in a slow red pulse, washing the deck in emergency color and turning 100 polished surfaces into bloodless mirrors. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Not the cadets in their navy gray dress uniforms. Not the mechanics standing half inside open maintenance panels. Not Commander Lyra Varel, whose gloved hand froze over her datapad. And certainly not the old human janitor standing alone beneath the ship with a mop in one hand and a dented cleaning bucket at his feet. Elias Mercer looked up as if he'd heard a ghost call his name from the bottom of the ocean. He was not an impressive man at first glance. 70, maybe older. White hair cut short with no concern for style. Shoulders slightly bent from years of work that looked small and thankless. Coveralls the color of old smoke, one knee darkened by fresh floor polish. The kind of man people stopped seeing after 3 seconds. The kind of man cadets brushed past without apology. The kind of man who cleaned up other people's messes and never complained about the smell. Yet the moment the ship said Admiral, something changed in the air. Not in him. In the room. The laughter that had been bouncing off the hangar walls only moments earlier vanished so completely that Lyra could hear the soft tick of coolant lines in the cruiser's hull. A cadet near the front let out a nervous breath. Another muttered, "That has to be a glitch." But the warship didn't sound confused. Its voice had carried recognition. Authority. Memory. Above them, the old cruiser, TSS Resolute, retired 40 years and stripped of combat clearance, continued waking section by section, red indicator lights rippling along its armored frame like embers under ash. Elias still hadn't spoken. His weathered face revealed almost nothing, but Lyra caught one detail she would remember later: his hand tightened around the mop handle so hard the vein stood out across his wrist. Not fear. Not pride. Something heavier than both. Something that looked a lot like grief. Then the overhead lights flickered, and Dock 12 fell into a silence so complete it felt sacred. 12 hours earlier, they had all been laughing at the old man who cleaned their floors. 12 hours earlier, Cadet Ren Torvak had kicked over Elias Mercer's bucket and called him a fossil in front of half the academy. 12 hours earlier, Lyra herself had watched the human kneel to wipe dirty water off polished steel while a room full of future officers looked through him like he was part of the wall. And now a warship older than most of the people in the building had called him Admiral. 12 hours earlier, Dock 12 had smelled like hot metal, citrus solvent, and rain trapped in old ventilation lines. Elias Mercer pushed his mop along the polished deck in slow, even strokes while the morning shift thundered around him in a blur of boots, clipped orders, and the bright confidence of people too young to believe history could still reach out and touch them. The academy always sounded busiest right before inspection. Cargo lifts whining overhead. Diagnostics chirping from open service panels. Cadets laughing too loud because they wanted everyone within 50 feet to know they were not nervous. Elias kept his eyes on the floor. It was easier that way. Easier to ignore the giant banners hanging from the rafters, each one celebrating victories won by officers whose names had already been turned into textbooks. Easier to ignore the sleek hull of the TSS Resolute resting in the center cradle like a sleeping cathedral, dark and silent and much too familiar. "Watch it, fossil!" The voice came with the scrape of a boot. Elias had just enough time to shift his bucket before Cadet Ren Torvak clipped it with one polished heel and sent grey water sloshing across the deck in a wide dirty fan. The cadets around him burst into laughter. Ren did not even bother to look sorry. Tall, sharp-jawed, uniform pressed so perfectly it looked poured onto him, he wore arrogance like another medal. "My mistake," he said, though his grin made the lie obvious. "Did not see you down there." Elias studied the spreading puddle for a second, then set the mop aside and knelt. "Most people do not," he said. The line only made them laugh harder. Someone in the back muttered, "That is because janitors are furniture." Another cadet raised a wrist console and pretended to record him. Ren folded his arms. "Tell me, old man. Did humanity really conquer half the spiral arm, or is that just another story they tell children before bed? Elias wrung out a rag and began wiping the water back toward the drain. Mostly paperwork, he said. Ren barked a laugh. Right. Hero of the mop fleet. More laughter. Bright. Thoughtless. The kind that bounced off steel and came back colder. From the upper catwalk, Commander Lyra Varel paused with a tablet tucked beneath one arm. Her dark blue skin caught the hangar lights with a faint metallic sheen, and the silver trim on her officer's coat marked her as Academy Command, not a student. She watched the scene for a beat too long to call it accidental. Elias could feel it without looking. Not pity. Assessment. That was different. Most people saw an old human on his knees with a rag in his hand and made up the rest of the story before he ever opened his mouth. Lyra, at least, seemed to notice details. The way he kept his back to the wall without thinking. The way his eyes flicked once toward the dormant warship every time a system's tone changed pitch. The way his hands, though spotted with age, did not tremble when Ren stepped closer and tried one last time to bait him into anger. Careful with the floor, old-timer, Ren said. Would not want the Admiral to slip. This time even Lyra did not smile. Elias just lowered his gaze, pushed the rag through the last of the water, and said nothing at all. The laughter followed Elias for another 30 feet, thinning only when a warning chime rolled across Dock 12 and every screen in the hangar flashed amber. The maintenance crews straightened almost as one. Overhead, magnetic cranes groaned to life, and a long shadow moved across the polished deck as the outer bay doors parted by inches and the Academy's tow rig guided a warship into view. Even after all these years, the TSS Resolute still had the kind of presence that made people lower their voices without being told. She was nearly 600 feet of scarred alloy and old authority, her hull darkened by time, her registry markings faded to pale ghosts under layers of storage dust. The ship did not glide so much as endure being moved, every inch of her looking too stubborn to belong in a museum and too tired to belong anywhere else. Cadets who had spent the last 5 minutes mocking a janitor now crowded the safety line in reverent silence, necks craned, eyes bright. Ren Torvak was first to recover his swagger. There she is, he said, as if the cruiser had arrived for his personal benefit. The most overrated ship in human history. A few cadets chuckled, but softly this time. Even they knew better than to be loud in front of something that had survived more years than they had lived. Elias did not move. The mop handle rested in his hand, forgotten. For the first time that morning, he was not looking at the floor. He was looking at the Resolute the way a man might look through a hospital window and see someone he loved sleeping on the other side of the glass. The expression on his face was so brief Lyra almost missed it. Not pride. Not nostalgia. Loss. Raw enough to make her chest tighten for reasons she did not care to examine. As the tow rig locked the cruiser into its cradle, a mechanic read out the intake status over the hangar intercom. External hull stable. Reactor cold. Core intelligent remains inactive. Attempting ceremonial boot sequence at 1300. That got the cadets talking again. The Resolute was famous for more than her war record. She had been one of the first coalition ships built with an adaptive command intelligence, an onboard system advanced enough to learn voices, habits, and battle patterns. No one had managed to wake it since the ship was mothballed for decades ago. The Academy had dragged her out for Founders Week, hoping for a clean activation and a nice speech from a retired historian. Ren smirked at the cruiser's weathered hull. They should have scrapped her for parts. Save the ceremony and turn her into shuttle plating. Elias finally moved. Then, but only enough to set the mop aside. He stepped toward the safety rail until the yellow line brushed the toes of his work boots. One hand rose almost unconsciously, stopping just short of the hull as if some old instinct still respected permission, rank, distance. Lyra watched his fingers hover in the air. They did not shake. They simply stayed there, inches from cold alloy, with the care of someone reaching toward memory instead of metal. You know, Ren said behind him, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, for a janitor, you sure look emotional about a pile of obsolete steel." Elias did not turn around. His eyes remained on the cruiser's scarred flank, on a faded insignia half hidden beneath grime, on a section of plating where the paint had once been repaired by hand instead of machine. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that Lyra had to step closer to catch it. "Some ships are not obsolete," he said. "Some are just waiting for the right voice." No one answered Elias right away. The mechanic at the primary console gave a small, dismissive snort and returned to his panel, fingers moving fast across a bank of holographic controls that washed his face in pale blue light. Around him, the activation team began their ceremonial boot sequence with the solemn confidence of people who had practiced it all week and expected the machine to cooperate simply because the schedule demanded it. One by one, status windows bloomed over the deck. Core handshake pending. Memory lattice offline. Voice recognition unavailable. Auxiliary rails cold. Lyra stepped down from the catwalk and moved closer to the operations circle, tablet tucked beneath her arm, her attention divided between the technicians and the old human still standing by the safety line with that unreadable expression on his face. Attempting command bridge wake, the lead engineer announced. He pressed a final sequence into the console. For a second, Dock 12 seemed to hold its breath. Then every light on the control board flashed yellow at once. A harsh tone cut through the hangar. Access denied. Legacy authorization protocol required. The engineer blinked at the message as if the ship had insulted his family. "That cannot be right," he muttered. "Run it again." They did. Same result. A third attempt only produced a deeper warning chime and a stubborn block of red text no one seemed happy to read aloud. Wren folded his arms, enjoying the discomfort now that it belonged to someone else. Maybe the old museum piece finally forgot how to listen. A few cadets laughed under their breath. The engineer shot them an irritated look and tried a different access path. It failed too. Elias watched in silence for another 10 seconds, then spoke without raising his voice. "You are pinging the wrong recognition band." The words were so calm they almost disappeared beneath the hum of the dock. But Lyra heard them. So did the engineer, who turned with a look usually reserved for gum on a dress shoe. "Excuse me." Elias nodded toward the main display. That cruiser was commissioned before the Coalition standardized bridge authorization on the green band spectrum. Her command intelligence would still be listening on the old blue band military channel. If you keep knocking on the wrong door, she will keep ignoring you. For a beat, nobody said anything. Then Wren barked a laugh. "Amazing. We have tactical advice from a man with a mop." The cadets joined in, and even one of the junior mechanics smiled before catching himself. The engineer's expression hardened. "Thank you for the input," he said in the tone of someone very much not thankful. "Please return to your duties." Elias gave a small shrug and bent to pick up his bucket. That should have been the end of it. It almost was. But Lyra had not stopped looking at the main display. Blue Band Military Channel. She knew enough naval history to recognize the phrase, and enough about old systems to know it was not impossible. More importantly, Elias had not sounded like a man guessing. He had sounded annoyed, the way experienced officers did when someone was mishandling equipment they loved. Before she could talk herself out of it, Lyra stepped past the engineer, entered a command override, and switched the handshake frequency from green to blue. The lead technician stared at her. "Commander, with respect, that protocol is 40 years out of date." "Then it and the ship have something in common," Lyra said. She hit execute. For half a second, nothing happened. Then, deep inside the cruiser, somewhere beneath layers of dormant steel and sealed corridors, a relay clicked awake. One thin line of white light appeared along the edge of the bridge canopy. Just one. But it was enough to turn the laughter off like someone had pulled a plug. Elias did not look surprised. He only lifted his bucket, took hold of the mop again, and went back to cleaning the floor as if waking a dead warship by accident was the least interesting thing he had done all day. By evening, Dock 12 had gone quiet in the way only military spaces ever did, not peaceful, just temporarily between orders. Most of the cadets had cleared out for mess hall rotation, and the activation team had moved their arguments to a conference room with glass walls and too much coffee. The Resolute remained in her cradle under low work lights, one narrow strip of illumination still glowing along the bridge canopy like a half-open eye that had changed its mind about going back to sleep. Elias Mercer was on his knees beneath the portside maintenance ramp, scrubbing a streak of hydraulic residue from the deck with a brush that had seen better years. The smell of solvent sat sharp in the back of his throat. He did not hear Commander Lyra Varel approach until her shadow joined his beneath the ship. "You were right," she said. Elias kept scrubbing for a moment longer, then leaned back on his heels and looked up at her. Out of uniform formation and away from cadets, she seemed younger than she did on the catwalk, though there was nothing soft about her posture. Her dark blue skin caught the warm hangar light like polished stone, and her silver-trimmed officer's coat was folded neatly over one arm instead of worn. A gesture, Elias noticed, of someone trying not to arrive as rank. About the recognition band, she added. "You were right." Elias dipped the brush into the bucket and watched cloudy water circle the metal bottom. That happened sometimes. It was not enough of an answer, and they both knew it. Lyra stepped closer to the cruiser's hull, glancing up at the faded registry numbers half lost beneath age and dust. "You did not sound like someone making an educated guess." "No," Elias said. "I did not." The honesty of it surprised her more than denial would have. For a few seconds the only sound was the soft ping of cooling metal somewhere high in the ship's frame. Lyra rested her fingertips against the lower access ladder, then looked back at him. "Why did you look sad when you touched this ship?" That, of all questions, made Elias still. Not "who are you?" Not "how do you know military legacy protocols?" Something quieter. Something more dangerous. He sat back against a cargo crate and stared up at the Resolute's hull for a long time before speaking. "Because coffins only carry the dead," he said at last. "Ships carry the living who could not save them." Lyra did not answer right away. She had heard officers talk about sacrifice, duty, strategic loss, all the clean words people used when they wanted to make grief sound efficient. This was not that. This sounded like a man who had spent years trying and failing to set something down. "Were you on her?" she asked softly. Elias's jaw shifted once, as if he were testing whether the truth still fit in his mouth. "Long ago." "As what?" He gave the faintest smile, tired and private. "Mostly paperwork." Lyra exhaled through her nose, not quite a laugh. "You know, that answer was more convincing this morning." It was not meant to be convincing. She studied him then, really studied him. The scar near his hairline almost hidden by white at the temples. The military neatness of his boots despite janitor coveralls. The way he always positioned himself with a line of sight to every door without appearing to think about it. None of it proved anything. All of it did. From somewhere deeper in the cruiser, a relay clicked again, followed by a low hum that neither of them had caused. Both of them looked up. The thin line of light at the bridge canopy brightened by a shade. Elias's expression changed so subtly another person might have missed it, but Lyra saw the ache in it. Saw the hope too, which was somehow worse. "She remembers you," Lyra said before. She could stop herself. Elias lowered his eyes to the brush in his hand. "Ships remember lots of things," he murmured. "The problem is that they usually remember them at the worst possible time." The next morning, the Academy turned Dock 12 into a theater. Portable bleachers had been rolled in along the starboard wall for cadets and visiting donors, the overhead lights had been brightened to a ceremonial white that flattened every face, and a raised tactical dais stood in the center of the hangar where cargo crates had been stacked the day before. On the far side of the deck, the Resolute rested in her cradle beneath a web of cables and diagnostic beams, silent again except for that narrow line of light at the bridge canopy that no one had been able to shut off. Elias Mercer arrived with a mop bucket in one hand and a floor buffer humming softly at his side, hoping to finish the polished walkway before the morning demonstration began. He should have known hope had no business in a military academy. Cadet Ren Torvak spotted him before he had made it 20 feet. There he is, Ren announced to the cluster of cadets gathered near the tactical dais, his voice carrying just enough to turn heads without technically shouting. Doc 12's resident war historian. A few of them laughed. More than a few looked eager. Elias kept walking. He had learned a long time ago that young people with an audience were rarely interested in mercy. "Leave it, Torvak," Lyra said from the operations rail. She stood with a datapad in hand and irritation written cleanly across her face, but irritation was not authority, and Ren knew it. He offered her a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "Just trying to improve morale, Commander." Then he stepped directly into Elias's path. "Actually, old man, I think you can help us." Around them, the cadets shifted closer. Visiting officers in dark dress coats paused mid-conversation. Even the technicians at the console slowed their work, sensing entertainment. Ren gestured toward the tactical dais, where a combat simulation was already loading across a curved wall of holographic stars. "You know so much about legacy systems," he said, smooth as polished glass. "Why not show us whether that knowledge is good for anything besides unsolicited commentary?" Elias's grip tightened around the bucket handle. "I have a floor to finish. And we have a demonstration to complete," Ren said. "Come on. Humor us." The smile on his face was almost friendly, which made it crueler somehow. Unless the great Mop Admiral is afraid of a little strategy exercise. A few cadets snorted. Someone whispered the phrase Mop Admiral again, and the nickname moved through the crowd like a lit fuse. Elias looked past Ren to the simulation wall. He did not need the labels to recognize the battlefield geometry. The crescent of debris near the inner moon. The narrow gravity well to starboard. The choke point between two fractured defense stations. Cold moved through him so fast it felt like a draft under the skin. Not because the scenario was difficult. Because he knew it. Knew it the way a scar knows weather. Lyra saw the change in his face at the exact moment he saw the map, and her stomach dropped. "Torvak," she said more sharply, stepping off the rail. "That is enough." Ren did not even turn around. "This is a public leadership exercise, Commander. If the janitor wants to decline, he can say so." He looked back at Elias, smiling wider now that he sensed an audience leaning in. "Well." For a long second Elias said nothing. The floor buffer hummed softly beside him, absurdly domestic in the middle of all that polished military pride. Then he set the bucket down, switched off the machine, and placed the mop carefully against the wall as if it deserved more respect than anyone in the room had shown him. "It is not a strategy exercise," he said quietly. "It is a memorial." The laughter that followed was thinner than Ren expected, but it came anyway. He swept one arm toward the dais. "Then by all means," he said. "Let us see how well you remember it." Elias climbed the tactical dais without hurry, but there was nothing uncertain in the way he moved. The laughter around him thinned as soon as he stepped into the simulation light. It washed his coveralls pale silver and threw the lines in his face into sharp relief, making him look less like a janitor and more like something the Academy had forgotten to catalogue. The holographic battlefield rotated above the command table in perfect detail, all fractured moons and drifting debris fields, the cold geometry of an old disaster rendered beautiful for educational purposes. Elias stopped in front of it and went very still. Lyra watched his eyes track across the map, not reading it but remembering it. That was the part that made her pulse quicken. People studied simulations. They memorized formations, casualty reports, fleet routes. Elias did none of that. He looked at the battlefield the way someone looks at a street where they used to live. Scenario parameters loaded, the Academy computer announced. Coalition forces outnumbered 3-1. Civilian evacuation convoy at risk. Predicted survival rate, 12%. A murmur rippled through the cadets. Even Ren's smug expression tightened a little. It was not an easy scenario. It had been designed that way on purpose. A no-win exercise for ambitious students who needed to be humbled by math. Ren folded his arms and leaned against the rail. "Go ahead, old man." Save the day. Elias did not answer. He reached toward the command interface, then stopped with his hand hovering over the glass. For 1 second, his fingers trembled. Not from age. Lyra knew that now. It was the tremor of impact, of memory arriving all at once. When he finally touched the controls, his voice came out low and steady. Move the second carrier group 12,000 yards port side. Kill external lights on the convoy. Rotate the damaged frigates into the debris shadow and let them look dead. The tactical officers at the side consoles exchanged confused glances. Wren laughed. That sacrifices your screen ships. No, Elias said. His eyes never left the battlefield. It asks them to be patient. He entered 3 more commands with the speed of a man who had not forgotten where any of the buttons lived. Cut engine signatures on every transport above 10 tons. Use the station wreckage to break thermal lock. Launch decoy beacons from the med ships, not the destroyers. They will chase the larger heat bloom. First. The simulation updated in real time, and the impossible began to bend. Enemy vectors shifted. The convoy slipped deeper into the debris corridor. A line of red hostile markers peeled away from the center mass exactly as Elias had predicted, drawn toward the false engine signatures now drifting from the medical ships. The room went quiet enough to hear people breathing. Lyra stepped closer to the dais without realizing she had moved. Elias's face had changed. The softness was gone. So was the weariness. What remained was something carved and precise, an old command present stripped of rank and ceremony and left with only the hard useful parts. Now split the rear guard, he said. Half stays visible. Half goes dark and loops through the gravity shear behind Moonfall. They do not know we mapped that current. One of the instructors blurted, that route was never published. Elias gave the smallest shrug. It worked anyway. The simulation rolled forward another 90 seconds. Enemy cruisers committed to the wrong flank. The convoy cleared the choke point. A battered cluster of blue coalition markers, doomed by every Academy model for the last 20 years, suddenly had a path out. No one laughed now. No one even looked at Wren. They were all staring at the old human in janitor coveralls who had just turned a memorial back into a battle and was winning it by remembering where the dead had once stood. The final enemy markers winked out of the convoy's path one by one, not destroyed, not defeated in any dramatic Academy sense, simply outmaneuvered, delayed, sent chasing ghosts while the civilian transport slipped through the corridor and vanished beyond the simulation boundary. A soft chime sounded over the tactical dais. Then the Academy computer, which had spent 20 years informing ambitious cadets that the scenario could only end in acceptable losses, spoke in its flat neutral voice. Outcome revised. Evacuation success probability, 87%. No one reacted at first. The number seemed to hang in the air like a translation error. Ren Torvak stared at the display with his mouth slightly open, all the easy arrogance drained out of his face. One of the visiting officers actually stepped closer to the dais and checked the simulation log as if the machine itself might have been tricked. Lyra did not move at all. She was watching Elias. He had not celebrated. Had not even straightened. He stood with one hand resting lightly on the command table, breathing a little harder than before, eyes fixed on the convoy markers as they crossed into safety. There was no triumph in his expression. Only relief so old it looked exhausted. Run debrief, one instructor said weakly. The Academy computer began listing tactical adjustments in crisp bullet points, but it never got past the first 3. Every light in Dock 12 went out at once. The hangar dropped into darkness so sudden and complete that several cadets gasped. Then a low-power surge rolled through the deck beneath their boots. Overhead, emergency strips flickered red. Across the hangar, the Resolute came alive. Not gradually this time. Fully. White running lights ignited along her hull in clean military lines. The old command crest on her flank glowed beneath layers of restored display paint. Cables hanging from her docking ports went taut and then dropped free one by one with metallic clanks that echoed through the dark like ceremonial bells. Somewhere deep in her frame, engines that should have remained cold began humming at idle, soft and enormous and unmistakably awake. Every head in the room turned toward the cruiser. Elias did not. He closed his eyes for one brief second, as if he had heard footsteps he had been dreading for 40 years. Then the ship spoke. Legacy command imprint verified, the voice said, richer now, no longer muffled by partial boot sequence. Biometric match confirmed. Vocal cadence confirmed. Tactical pattern recognition confirmed. The red emergency lights painted Elias's face in long shadows as he slowly turned toward the ship. On the main hangar screen, rows of sealed archival files burst open all at once, page after page of military insignia and battle reports flooding into view. Lyra caught the name first because she had been waiting for it since the moment he corrected the recognition band. Elias Mercer. Flag. Rank, Admiral. Commanding Officer, TSS Resolute. Status, presumed deceased. The crowd did not gasp this time. It forgot how. Even Wren looked smaller somehow, like his uniform had suddenly stopped fitting. The ship's voice filled the hangar one final time, and this time there was no room left for doubt, no technical explanation, no glitch to hide behind. Welcome back, Admiral Elias Mercer, it said. Last surviving commander of the Resolute. Authorization accepted. For a long moment, nobody in Dock 12 breathed. Then Lyra looked at the old mop leaning against the wall beside the tactical dais, looked back at the man standing under the glow of his own buried history, and understood with a sick, quiet clarity that the Academy had spent the last day laughing at a legend while he cleaned up after them. No one moved. The warship's light stretched across Dock 12 in long white bars, turning polished steel into a mirror and every face in the room into something pale and uncertain. The Academy computer still hovered above the tactical dais, frozen on the line that mattered more than any simulation result ever could. Admiral Elias Mercer. Presumed deceased. The words hung there like a confession. Elias stood beneath them in janitor coveralls with solvent on one sleeve and grey at his temples, looking less like a resurrected hero than a man who had just been found by a past he had spent years trying not to disturb. Ren Torvak was the first to break, though not with courage. He took one stumbling step backward and nearly hit the rail behind him. I did not know, he said, and the sentence sounded thin the moment it left his mouth. It was not really an apology. Just fear trying to dress itself as one. Elias looked at him for a second, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, but with the quiet weariness of someone who had outlived the need to be avenged by embarrassment. Then he turned away. That was somehow worse. Lyra moved before anyone else did. She crossed the deck in a straight line, boots clicking softly against the steel, and stopped 3 feet in front of him. For one heartbeat she said nothing. Her eyes lifted to his face, then to the old mop. Propped against the wall beside the dais, then back again. When she spoke, her voice was low enough to belong to the silence rather than break it. I should have stopped them yesterday. Elias gave the faintest tilt of his head. Yes, he said. No cruelty. No comfort. Just truth. Lyra drew in a breath, set her shoulders, and came to full attention. The motion was crisp, military, and utterly unforced. Then she saluted him. It was not because the ship had named him. It was not because the files had proved he was important. It was because in the space of one terrible morning she had understood exactly what kind of officer she wanted to be, and exactly how close she had come to failing that test. The sound of her hand striking the brim of her cap was small, but in the stunned quiet of Dock 12 it carried farther than any shouted command. One by one, others followed. The visiting officers first, faces gone solemn. Then the instructors. Then the cadets, slower, ashamed enough now to feel the weight of their own arms as they raised them. Ren saluted last. Elias watched the line form in front of him, row after row of polished uniforms and lowered eyes, and something unreadable moved across his face. Not pride. Maybe grief making room for something else. Maybe nothing at all. When the last hand dropped, he bent down and picked up the mop himself. A few cadets flinched at the sight of it, as if the object had become sacred simply because they had learned whose hand held it. Elias rested the handle against one shoulder and looked at the room full of future officers. "If you want to know what kind of command you deserve," he said, "do not look at how people treat admirals. Look at how they treat janitors, mechanics, cooks, and the tired person cleaning the floor after everyone else has gone home. Rank only tells you who can give orders. Character tells you who remembers that every ship floats because ordinary people keep showing up to do ordinary work well." No one spoke. Even the Resolute seemed to quiet herself around his words, her engine hum dropping to a softer note that felt almost respectful. Elias glanced up at the old cruiser then, and for the first time all day, a small real smile touched his mouth. "You took your time," he murmured. The ship answered at once, voice warm with a strange machine patience. "You ordered me to wait, Admiral." A few stunned cadets looked at one another. Lyra felt her throat tighten. Of course he had. Of course even now the ship was still following his last command. Elias shook his head once, almost amused, and set the mop back against the wall. Then he stepped toward the Resolute, placing one weathered hand against her hull at last. The metal glowed faintly beneath his palm. "I am not coming back," he said quietly. A murmur ran through the crowd, but he did not turn around. "The war is over. It should stay that way." "Acknowledged," the ship replied after a beat. "Then what are your orders, Admiral?" Elias stood there for a long moment, white lights tracing the lines of age across his face, the entire hangar waiting on a man who had spent the last day being treated as invisible. When he finally spoke, his voice was so gentle Lyra almost missed it. "Teach them," he said. "Teach them what we were protecting in the first place." The bridge lights brightened by one soft degree, like a nod. "Command accepted." Elias stepped back from the hull and looked over his shoulder at Lyra. "Command of RL." She straightened instinctively. "Sir." Dock 12 still has a dirty floor. For half a second she thought he was joking. Then she saw the dry humor in his eyes and, beneath it, the offer. Not punishment. A lesson. Lyra took the mop from where he had left it and nodded once. "Yes, Admiral." "Elias," he corrected. "I retired a long time ago." Then, before anyone could stop him with speeches or questions or the kind of gratitude he clearly did not want, he picked up his dented bucket and walked toward the hangar doors with the unhurried stride of a man going back to work. The crowd parted for him in complete silence. Ren moved first, stepping out of the way so fast he nearly collided with the rail. Cadets who had laughed at him the day before now lowered their eyes as he passed. Elias did not look left or right. At the threshold he paused just long enough to glance back once. Lyra stood near the center of the dock, officer's coat folded away, sleeves rolled up, running the mop across a streak of dried solvent with careful even strokes while a room full of cadets watched and, slowly, began to help. Beyond them, the Resolute rested awake in her cradle, no longer a dead monument but something gentler and stranger, an old warship choosing, at last, to become a classroom. Elias gave the scene one last quiet nod and disappeared into the corridor. Long after he was gone, Dock 12 remained silent except for the soft swish of a mop over steel and the low patient hum of a ship that remembered exactly who had taught it how to wait. And somewhere between those two sounds, an academy full of future officers finally learned the difference between power and dignity.